Welcome. Good morning, everyone. I'm Barbara Vanich, Chief Auditor and Director of Professional Standards at the PCAOB. And once again, it's my pleasure to be here with you today. I want to welcome you to this meeting of the Standards and Emerging Issues Advisory Group of the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. I'd like to welcome members, observers, board members, and the public watching this meeting. By way of introductions, I would like to use this opportunity to introduce you to two very important additions to our staff. And it's Saba Kumar, our new investor advocate who joined us in July, and Todd Cranford, our stakeholder liaison. I think some of you may have had a chance to speak with Todd, but Todd previously worked as special counsel to board member Thompson, but agreed to serve as our stakeholder liaison. And we're so very happy to have Saba and Todd in these important roles. Saba, I'll turn to you if you would like to say a few words, and then Todd, why don't you go after Saba?
Thank you, Barb. Good morning, everyone. I'm Saba Kumar. I am the first ever, I have the privilege of serving as the first ever investor advocate for the PCAOB. Although my primary responsibility is to work closely with the investor advisory group, I would love to connect with you all as well, because I know that every single one of you plays an important role in enhancing our work to protect investors. So please feel free to reach out, and you know how to reach me. Thank you, Barb, and I look forward to meeting you all.
Thank you, Saba.
Yes, well, good morning, everyone. And thank you, Barb, for the opportunity to just say a few words. As Saba just said, these roles, and Barb said, these roles are very important. And we appreciate all the time and the effort that you put into what you're doing. We know it's volunteer service, but it's critically important to the board that we have your input. And obviously not just you, but from your networks, your circles. And I look forward to being able to work with you and coordinating with Saba so that we are able to gather as much information as we can over time to make our job so that we can do our jobs better. As Barb said, I've been at the board for a while, but I know I've had the pleasure of being able to work with a handful of you in previous roles, and looking forward to continuing that. Thank you, and have a good meeting.
Thank you, Todd and Saba. So we have a full agenda. This morning, you'll primarily be hearing from us, first from Chair Williams on PCAOB developments. Then I'll provide a brief standard setting update. And after that, Michael Gerbett and Patrick Castine will provide you an overview of the Office of Economic and Risk Analysis. After lunch, we hope primarily to hear from you. First, we have a session on firm and engagement performance metrics, and then we'll talk about fraud consideration. Now, we've built in plenty of time for member questions and comments throughout the meeting. We do ask that you hold initial questions or comments until after the standard setting update. And as a reminder, if you'd like to say something, please use the raise your hand function. If that's not working, just type something in the chat function. No need to write your question, just a call on me or something like that, and we'll make sure we get to you. We'll try to respond in the order the hands are raised or the chat is received, and thank you in advance for your patience. As a reminder, if you have any technical difficulties during the meeting, please email Todd or Kent Bonham or Brian Goodnow. And again, we'll start taking questions and comments after my update on the standard setting agenda. And now my final responsibility here is, although others may repeat it, is to state that for all PCAOB representatives speaking at this meeting, the views expressed by each of the presenters are their own views and do not necessarily reflect the views of the board or other board members or its staff. And with that, it's my pleasure to hand over the meeting to Chair Williams.
Thank you, Barb. And before I begin, I'll repeat that standard disclaimer, which is the views that I express here are my own, not necessarily the views of the other board members of the PCAOB staff. From workers saving for retirement to parents saving to put their kids through college, and anyone who depends on the integrity of our capital markets to invest for the future, people are at the heart of everything we do at the PCAOB. And it's critical we elevate the voices of everyday retail investors who we serve. As you know, Reconstituting the Standards and Emerging Issues Advisory Group, or what I call the SEIAG, was the first major action we took as a board, and we're grateful for your ongoing feedback as we execute our mission to protect investors. I want to join Barb in welcoming Saba and Todd. I know many of you have already worked with Saba and Todd, and if you've not, I encourage you to reach out. We're really thrilled to have them on our team. And together as a board, we've set an ambitious goal for the PCAOB, modernizing our standards, enhancing our inspections, strengthening our enforcement, and improving our operational and organizational effectiveness through initiatives like reimagining our approach to stakeholder engagement. We have a lot of work ahead of us. The SEIAG will continue to serve a critical role in advising us along the way, and already we are off to a strong start. Earlier this year, the board announced one of the most ambitious standard-setting agendas in the PCAOB's history. And last month, we posted an update to that agenda. We are working actively to update more than 30 standards within 10 standard-setting projects, and we're just getting started. PCAOB staff have put pen to paper on every single project, and they're diligently working to move them as quickly as possible. Barb is going to provide us with a detailed update on our progress in a moment. We've already finalized our other auditor standard, and we expect to move forward with the quality control and contribution standard setting projects before the end of the year. I want to thank many of you for your input on the importance of performance metrics at both the firm and engagement level, and we are taking action. As Barb will talk about more in a moment, we took the first step of putting this project on our research agenda, but make no mistake, placing the project on our research agenda is a signal this board is actively working to move it, and we are serious about getting it done. As you know, this board was very clear from the beginning that projects would not stay on our research agenda for more than a year. My plan is to move this project to the standard setting agenda in 2023 and advance it in short order from there. We will continue to rely on your consultation and input along the way. Inspections are one of the most important tools we have to hold firms accountable and keep investors protected. Our 2021 inspection reports for the Big Six accounting firms will be coming out later this year, and we will be issuing a spotlight document highlighting major trends and findings in the coming weeks. So we encourage everyone to keep an eye out for that. Our inspections division is constantly adjusting to be responsive to new and emerging risks across the globe, whether it's SPAC or de-SPAC transactions, cryptocurrencies, or how firms are addressing the effects of supply chain disruptions and rising costs on company operations. This includes our target team, which consists of inspectors who focus on the latest risks and execute in-depth reviews across audit firms using information gathering inspection procedures that extend beyond traditional inspection procedures. This inspection approach has enabled us to develop observations across audit firms, provide timely insights to inspected audit firms, and inform and shape our future inspection focus areas. Your input is critical as we identify areas for our target team to inspect. Our inspectors like to say the sun never sets on PCAOB inspections because each year the PCAOB inspects approximately 250 audit firms and reviews 900 engagements across the globe. But as you know, for more than a decade, our access in mainland China and Hong Kong has been restricted. In August, we took the first step toward opening our access in mainland China and Hong Kong. I joined the China Securities Regulatory Commission and the Ministry of Finance of the People's Republic of China in signing the most detailed and prescriptive agreement we have ever reached. On paper, the agreement guarantees the PCAOB complete access to inspect and investigate any firm we choose with no loopholes and no exceptions. Now we must find out whether what we have on paper holds up in practice. In September, PCAOB teams began arriving in Hong Kong, where they are conducting inspections of firms headquartered in mainland China and Hong Kong and putting that agreement to the test. By the end of this year, the PCAOB will make determinations whether the PRC authorities have allowed us to inspect and investigate completely, or they've continued to obstruct our efforts. If I sound like a broken record when I say no loopholes and no exceptions, that's good, because the law demands complete access. The agreement we signed with the Chinese counterparts guarantees complete access, and the PCAOB will accept nothing less than complete access when we make our determinations. This board is approaching enforcement with a renewed vigilance. We intend to use every tool in our enforcement toolbox and impose significant sanctions where appropriate to ensure there are consequences for putting investors at risk and that bad actors are removed. This includes substantial monetary penalties and significant or permanent individual bars and firm registration revocations. We are rethinking how we identify cases, the types of cases we pursue, and the sanctions we impose. Those who break the rules should know that we won't be constrained by the types of cases the PCAOB has pursued in the past. We won't be limited to the level of penalties that have been previously assessed, and we will seek admissions of wrongdoing in appropriate cases, for example, where the conduct is intentional or egregious. Under this board, we've more than doubled the total dollar amount of penalties imposed against individuals in 2022 as compared to each of the past 5 years. This includes breaking the record for the largest monetary penalty ever imposed on an individual in a settled case twice. At the same time, we've quadrupled the average penalties against firms in cases where firms fail to meet PCAOB reporting requirements, and we've increased the average penalties against firms in all other cases by about 50%. In the past 5 years, the PCAOB has assessed penalties against individuals less than half of the time and firms only about 86% of the time. This year, it's 100%. None of this is possible without the expertise, dedication, and hard work of our incredible PCAOB staff. Along with Barb, I want to thank Michael Gerbert, Patrick Castine, Sky Sims, Jessica Watts, Jonathan Fluharty-Jadi, Brian Degano, and Stephanie Hunter for presenting here today, and the team from our offices of Communications Engagement, Chief Auditor, and Data Security and Technology who work behind the scenes to make this meeting possible. They've put together a robust and informative agenda covering an array of topics, and we're interested in hearing your perspectives. As Barb mentioned, during the meeting today, she will share additional details on all the work her team is doing to modernize our standards. Each one of these projects requires robust economic analysis from our team in the Office of Economic and Risk Analysis, or as referred to them, OIRA. Later today, you'll hear from Michael and Patrick, who will provide an overview of the great work performed by OIRA. This includes, in addition to economic analysis, post-implementation reviews, risk analysis to support our inspections and enforcement efforts, economic modeling, business intelligence, and research. Next, we'll hear from Sky, Jessica, Jonathan, and Michael on firm and engagement performance metrics, including metrics that are publicly available today. As part of their presentation, we look forward to discussing how such metrics are used today and what additional metrics would be useful when evaluating firms. We will then close with Brian and Stephanie, who will lead a discussion where we hope to hear your views and experiences regarding how auditors consider fraud. They will cover certain fraud-related topics, including anti-fraud programs and controls, lessons that can be learned from other professions, the competence necessary to be able to detect fraud, and the role that technology is playing in performing audit procedures to identify fraud. Thank you again to all of our members of the Standards and Emerging Issues Advisory Group for being here today. Now I'd like to turn the program back to Barb to get us started. Thanks.
Thank you, Chair Williams. And I will give Brian a minute to get the slides up. Well, in the interest of time, I'll go ahead and begin. So turning to our standard setting update, first I want to provide you a brief update on our project on the supervision of other auditors. And second, provide an overview of the updates we made to the standard setting and research agendas in October. So on our supervision of other auditors project, it was approved by the board in June and by the SEC in August. The amendments were designed to strengthen the auditing standards that apply when the auditor that issues the opinion, which we refer to as the lead auditor, uses other auditors in an audit. As stated in our public releases, working with other auditors can differ from working with people in the same firm. The lead auditor may encounter differences in business practices, market conditions, and cultural norms between auditors in different parts of the world. And in addition, other auditors involved in the audit may have different systems of quality control. Their knowledge of it and experience with US GAAP, PCAOB, or SEC requirements may also differ. And so, therefore, the amendments are focused on increasing the lead auditor's involvement in and evaluation of the work of other auditors. And it's our intention that the heightened attention should improve communications among auditors and enhance the ability of the lead auditor to prevent or detect deficiencies in the work of other auditors. As part of this project, we also issued a new standard that applies to dividing responsibility for the audit with another accounting firm. And while this situation is relatively infrequent in practice, it was nonetheless important to address. You can advance the slide, Brian. The amendments and new standard related to other auditors are effective for audits beginning on or after December 15th, 2023, or said another way, for 2024 audits. If you would advance the slide, please. Thank you. So as we said earlier, the agenda is meant to be dynamic. The short-term agenda now includes 7 projects, and it reflects several key changes since we posted it in May. First, we completed the other auditors project and therefore removed it from the agenda. Next, we updated the timing for 3 projects: non-compliance with laws and regs, which I'll refer to after this as NOCLAR, the attestation standards, and confirmations. We also added 2 projects to the short-term agenda, a project called AS1000 and a new standard-setting project that considers amendments related to certain aspects of designing and performing audit procedures involving technology-assisted data analysis. And in conjunction with that, we removed our research project on audit evidence. And finally, we've added firm engagement performance metrics to our research agenda. By way of reminder, short-term projects are projects where the Office of the Chief Auditor expects board action during the coming 12 months. The projects on the short-term agenda that we discussed at the last meeting include quality control, NOCLAR, the attestation standards, going concern, and confirmation. And as mentioned in October, we added 2 more projects to the short-term agenda. Now, we have spent a significant amount of time with the board on all of the short-term projects since this group last met, and we've made substantial progress. While each project is a priority, we recognize the significance of our project on quality control. And as noted on the agenda, we continue to hope to present the board a recommendation to propose a new standard on quality control this year. Taking into account developments in a number of areas, including information from our oversight activities and comments on our 2019 concept release, we continue to think about whether the QC standards could be improved by expressly requiring a risk-based approach to QC, including well-defined quality objectives and a systematic effort to identify and proactively manage risks to achieving those objectives, emphasizing firm governance, the tone at the top, and individual accountability, providing more direction regarding monitoring activities and remediation of identified deficiencies to encourage ongoing feedback that would drive continuous improvement. And that is intended to help firms prevent or detect QC problems before they result in engagement deficiencies. Addressing changes in the audit practice environment, including increasing participation of other firms and outside resources, the role of firm networks, the evolving use of technology and other resources, and the increasing importance of internal and external communications. Providing for a rigorous annual evaluation of a firm's QC system and for reporting on that evaluation, and updating requirements related to identified engagement deficiencies. We continue to progress our projects on confirmations, going concern, and no CLAR. Since we last met, we've made significant progress on confirmations, and while earlier we thought that we wouldn't have a board action until 2023, we now anticipate there will be a board action this year. Now, with respect to confirmations, we issued a proposal back in 2010, and that proposal, among other things, required confirmation procedures for specific accounts, including cash and accounts receivable. It incorporated procedures in response to the risk of material misstatement. It addressed areas of investigating exceptions and reflected in confirmation responses and evaluating non-responses to confirmation requests, and addressed certain aspects of technology used in the confirmation process. Our current project team started with a proposed standard and considered significant comments. And while we are considering comments received on the 2010 proposal, we're also taking into account the current environment and the use of technology in facilitating the confirmation process. With respect to going concern and no CLAR, we anticipate action in the next 12 months. However, I will note that we won't be in a position to make a recommendation to the board on no CLAR this calendar year, as we earlier anticipated, and as such, now anticipate a proposal in 2023. For our project on no CLAR, we are considering, among other things, enhancing the auditor's identification of potential noncompliance with laws and regulations, and enhancing the requirements related to the evaluation and communication of potential instances of noncompliance. And for our project ongoing concern, we're considering, among other things, enhancing the auditor's identification of conditions and events that could indicate financial distress, strengthening the auditor's evaluation of the company's plans when determining whether those plans alleviate substantial doubt, and enhancing the auditor's reporting of a going concern uncertainty. With respect to the attestation standards, in September, we published a brief staff request for information and comment on matters related to the application and use of our interim attestation standards. Input from the public will help inform any potential recommendations we make to the board regarding those standards. The request included questions about the use of attestation reports, questions on current practice, potential updates to requirements, and questions to inform our economic analysis. The comment period ended last week, and we received 20 comment letters. Since we believed it was appropriate to get public input, we now anticipate a board action in 2023 as opposed to in 2022. So as mentioned at the last meeting, we're evaluating the remaining interim standards, and as we complete our work, we intend to add projects to the standard setting agenda. As part of our work on the interim standards, we added a project referred to as AS1000. And AS1000 represents the first standard setting project related specifically to the work of our interim standards team. Now, the auditing standards included in this group of standards are AS1001, Responsibilities and Functions of the Independent Auditor, AS1005, Independence, AS1010, Training and Proficiency of the Independent Auditor, and AS1015, Due Professional Care in the Performance of Work. Now, these standards are foundational and are applicable to all firms and to all audits. As part of our efforts, we're also looking at AS2815, the meaning of present fairly in conformity with generally accepted accounting principles, because it too could be viewed as foundational. Now, like other interim standards, these standards continue to be in effect substantially in the form adopted by the board back in 2003. But in the staff's view, the concepts in these standards, for example, due care and professional skepticism, remain sound and are as relevant today as they were when those standards were issued. However, we do see opportunities to modernize and streamline through updates that would clarify auditor responsibilities, enhance the usability of the standards by making them easier to read, understand, and apply, and in addition, align the requirements further as appropriate with other PCAOB rules and standards. You'll note on the agenda that we anticipate board action on this project in 2023. We also added a project related to certain aspects of designing and performing audit procedures that involve technology-assisted data analysis to the short-term agenda. And these amendments are based on the past few years of research conducted by the staff. As the use of data analysis in the audit has increased, it's informed our thinking about certain areas of the standards where additional guardrails would be appropriate to ensure that certain risks related to the use of data analytics are consistently addressed across firms. And over the years, we've also identified areas where some believe the standard should be clarified to better address data analytics as it's used in the audit today. In some cases, we've made clarifications that didn't require rulemaking through our previously issued staff publications, but in other cases, we believe it might be appropriate to make amendments to our standards to make clarifications. Now, in conjunction with adding this project, we removed our research project on audit evidence. That project was added to the agenda to address matters identified as part of our work on data and technology. And those matters we believe will be addressed through the amendments project, in addition to some staff guidance we issued back in 2021. As we don't believe there are additional matters that need to be resolved at this time, we removed the research project on audit evidence. But in the future, if technology evolves or other matters come to our attention, it is possible that additional projects related to the audit evidence standard could be contemplated. Brian, if you could go to slide 8, the midterm standard setting projects. So we did not make any changes to the midterm standard setting agenda. Although we have staff assigned to these projects, we don't anticipate board action in the next 12 months. We are very much looking forward to your input on the fraud standard this afternoon. And as mentioned at the last meeting, work from our interim standards team will potentially result in projects being added to the standard setting agenda. Moving on to the research project. So with respect to our research project on data and technology, we see the amendments that are on the short-term agenda really as a first step to addressing technology in the audit. And as such, the research project on technology remains on our agenda. We'll continue to understand information from our oversight activities and take the use of technology into account in our other standard setting projects. Finally, in response to views from advisory groups that we heard back in June, we added a research project on firm and engagement performance metrics. The research project, as described on our website, includes considering metrics already disclosed by firms, along with the work that PCAOB has done over the years and the efforts by the investor advisory group. We also look forward to our discussion with you on that topic this afternoon. With that, I will pause and we can open it up for any questions people have. And Brian, if you could take the slide down so we could see all the faces.
Jeff Mahoney.
Jeff, you're on mute.
Jeff, you're still on mute. Nope, not yet.
Jessica, maybe are there other hands up, and we could come back to Jeff. He could work with
Brian Croto's hand just went up. Brian.
Yes, good morning, and thanks for that, Barb. I was just going to comment. Well, first of all, congratulations on the completion of the other auditor standard, and obviously an aggressive standard setting agenda, as you've said, with a couple projects still with proposals this year, and then a number for next year. I think 7 in total. And I guess just the question I had for you is, whether you plan to make use of, committees or task forces. I noticed today's agenda topics really don't relate to any of the 7 projects where you have upcoming proposals, and certainly to the extent that this group could be helpful as you're developing the proposals. Wonder if we'd have a chance to comment on those projects, either through this kind of a forum or again in subcommittees or task forces or something of that sort.
Sure, Brian, happy to answer that. And I think that we're just beginning to start to think about how to use subcommittees and some of the other features in the charter. As I mentioned at the last meeting, in some cases for us to make meaningful progress on the agenda projects, we will likely just move to proposals, and we'll encourage all advisory group members to comment either through their organizations or in other ways. I'd also say that since we met in June, it's taken a few months for the board to go through all of the wonderful documents we've provided them. And I think really just within the last month, some questions are emerging where there may be support from the board to bring some of those topics to the advisory groups to seek additional input. But in other cases, as I mentioned at the last meeting, many of these projects have gotten input from advisory groups over the years because they're really not new projects on the agenda. But stay tuned. I think we'll be having some discussions to plan for the advisory groups for next year, and we're already thinking about some ideas for subcommittees and things of that nature.
Thank you.
Jeff, do you want to see if your audio would work? Nope. Okay.
We'll get your question offline and respond to it, Jeff. Don't worry.
Christine Devine.
Thank you. And a little bit touches on Brian, who got to it first. But first of all, also echo the congratulations to you, Barb, and thank you for your very comprehensive update on standard setting. And thank you, Chair Williams, for your remarks as well. My comment really related to the QC standard, which you both touched upon in your remarks, and just an observation that it would be helpful if sufficient time is allowed for us to consider that comment on that and then ask clarifying questions, which I think kind of dovetails to Brian's point about the process for mechanism to provide input, particularly on that, just because it's so foundational, clearly, to audit quality.
Again, we're rapidly moving toward a proposal on quality control, and I know that there are those who might want to provide input during the comment period. We'll see what the comment period yields. If there are matters we think that would like the advisory groups to weigh in on, you might see that on the agenda in the new year. But we also are aware of how critically behind we are other standards in improving the QC standard. So we also feel a need to get that standard setting project out to the public.
John Bendel.
Hey, Barb, can you hear me?
We can.
Yes.
Okay. Hey, congrats again, Barb. Thank you for the comprehensive update. Question is a little bit related to the first, but not as much the advisory group involvement, but just given the great agenda you have and the ambitious agenda, which is well laid out, how have you thought about sort of the comment are you thinking about it similar or a little bit different? Because it is a large volume, quality is such a huge importance. And how are you thinking about navigating that just with maybe a higher volume than you've had historically and getting the right sort of process? Is it going to be the same, a little bit different? You thinking through that?
I think it depends. I mean, we do make use of some software that makes the comment analysis a little more efficient, and we do have a number of people who can pitch in to help. I mean, it will be interesting to see. We generally on most standard setting projects get less than 40 comments, unless it's something that really affects many more stakeholders, like the auditor's reporting model. So I think we'll just see as that happens. And again, in the past, with advisor groups, sometimes we've come back just to provide a summary of comments, so that you're aware of what's going on. But in other cases, we may seek views if there are conflicting views from commenters. So we've done things a number of ways over the years, and I wouldn't imagine that would change much.
John White.
Okay. I was looking at the attestation project and was reading through it last night and didn't see any mention of ESG or the like in the announcement of it. I was just curious, do you have any preliminary thinking about whether that's going to interrelate with the SEC climate proposal that talks obviously about attestation of greenhouse gases?
Well, I think that it could be used for those types of engagements, but it's broader than that, and it could also be used for other types of attestation engagements. That was one of the reasons we wanted to get some input before we provided a recommendation to the board, because we just don't have a lot of detailed insight into whether some of those standards are used much, if at all. But I also think we got a lot of variety in views on ESG. I think some people prefer a separate standard, a separate subject matter standard, and so we'll just have to see how it develops. Other people made recommendations, such that we should just consider following very closely what the IAASB does in that space, because I believe they're going down a path of having a specific standard. I don't want to speak for the ASB, but I think they're maybe thinking about updating guidance, and so we'll have to see, what happens.
Well, as a great supporter of the PCAOB, I think I've said this before, but I believe you should try to own some of this space. And I think that's an important role for the PCAOB. So I urge you to focus on it, because I think it belongs to you.
Thank you, John.
There are no other hands at this moment. Oh, Lynn Turner. Lynn, you're on mute.
There we go. I just want to echo Mr. White's remarks that you need to own this space. And while we don't know what the SEC will do, data from the Center for Audit Quality clearly shows that the capital markets are demanding the information, investors are demanding the information, and numerous companies are providing that information, and investors have asked for assurance on it. We need to make sure we get the assurance on the financial statements done right first and foremost, but already the PCAOB is running well behind what's happening in the capital markets, and it'd be nice for once to see the PCAOB actually be a leader rather than sitting on their hands as they watch what's going on at the IAASB or elsewhere, and be a leader rather than a follower. So I echo John's comments.
Thank you, Lynn.
Bob Hirth.
Thank you. Just to kind of comment on John and Lynn's thing, and to not to pile on, but to give you some facts. Over 50% of the S&P 500 get some form of third-party assurance on some part of their ESG reporting. A high percentage of that in the U.S. is not from accounting firms. IFAC has a great report that summarizes sustainability assurance all around the world. So you might want to look at that. And then 420 of the S&P 500 now, so over 80% of those companies report using the industry-specific SASB standard. So there's plenty of reporting, and it's something, of course, we can all talk through in terms of jurisdiction. But my view is these are public reports that stakeholders are relying on, and certainly from an investor protection standpoint, It's something that needs everybody's attention. So I think I'm just agreeing with Lynn and with John.
You know, I'll if I can insert something here. I know we have other questions, but you know, one of the theme that's coming through the comment letters is that, you know, audit firms are not using our standards, and at present there would be nothing to compel them to use a PCAOB standard. You know, even in the event we could issue an ESG specific standard shortly. So maybe if anyone could has follow-up questions, or I mean, you know, it's one of the things that we think about is if we build it, would anyone come?
Well, on that too, you know, I'm on the AICPA, we call it the Sustainability Assurance and Advisory Task Force. And certainly there's plenty of action going on at the AICPA, you know, level on those standards. You know, certainly others will have a view. My view is I think you've got to get jurisdiction over it. John, you may know more about this. My understanding was that audits are defined as financial statement audits under the Sarbanes-Oxley legislation. So I don't know what that means to help or hurt the PCAOB to do that. But I guess you have to figure out, do you have enough jurisdiction so people would have to follow your standards? But certainly there's a lot of action going on at the AICPA level, because then you can imagine as a client service expansion of services opportunity for the accounting profession. It's huge. You know, even without the SEC rule, most companies are going to have some sort of greenhouse gas table that's going to have some kind of assurance, and the world seems to be wanting to move from no assurance to limited assurance to reasonable assurance over a period of time. So I don't know if that gets to your point, but I'd like to say, to John's point, if you could own this, if you could somehow, like was done for broker dealers, get jurisdiction, then certainly any standards you have would have to be followed.
Thank you, Bob.
John, you were mentioned a couple of times. Did you want to respond?
Well, I don't know the answer to the specific question, but it sounds like others are echoing my belief that you want to be in this space. And as I say, I think you want to own this space. I guess given just kind of the sequencing of events here, I don't think, here I'm predicting, but I don't think the SEC climate proposal is going to, you know, put this in your jurisdiction for public companies alone. I mean, obviously, it's designed, it's set up now to have other people that can provide, other entities that can, or organizations that can provide the standards. But you don't know how that might evolve. I also think that to the extent that you would be getting, companies would be getting their ESG attestation from their regular auditor, I mean, from their financial statement auditor, I think I just feel like the likelihood that the standard that they would use in that setting would be the PCAOB standard as well, because they're within your jurisdiction, and it just would seem to be the logical place to go if you have a workable, available standard, and you're using your traditional financial statement auditor to do your whatever ESG assurance you're using. I don't think it's. I think if you create it, I think it'll get used, or you enhance it.
Okay, so we have a lot of hands up, and I can go to the next one, but if there was anyone else on that specific topic, I wanted to finish that out. Okay, I got Dane Mott, Lynn Turner, and Ron Edmonds. And Peg.
Sure.
Okay, and Sandy. So let's start with Dane, and then
Sure. Just to provide an alternative view, I'm a big supporter of ESG. I think it's hugely important to investors, but I don't think you should be owning this space at this point, quote unquote. I think there's so much work to be done on improving audit quality at this point that I would really be concerned that taking on that large space would just occupy too much of the board's headspace and resources, and there'd be a vacuum, and it would suck resources from the important mission of improving audit quality. You know, just as a data point, the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners does a study of frauds every year, and only 4% are being caught by the audit profession. You know, of the 2,000 plus frauds they investigated this year, only 4 were caught, 4% were caught by the external auditor. So I just think there's more work to do there. Let's get that done, and then let's talk about ESG down the road if we're all kind of happy that we're doing a good job at improving audit quality.
Thank you, Dane.
Lynn?
There are a couple points to be made here. First of all, SOX Section 101 does not define audit in the context or audit services in the context of just financial statements. So it's a very broad definition, and clearly it's a space the PCAOB can own if they choose to do so. In the SEC proposal, they specifically state that someone providing an audit attestation standards on ESG could follow PCAOB, AICPA, or other standards such as the International Accounting and Auditing. If the PCAOB is willing to give up the space here for ESG type stuff, it raises a serious question about whether or not they need to give up the space in other areas as well if other people can do a better job for the markets. And the reason people haven't used these since the original attestation standard was issued in the mid-80s for MD&A is the PCAOB has fallen behind the AICPA in developing a standard for auditing and looking at ESG disclosures. And since the AICPA standard is more updated, more relevant and current today than the PCAOB, there's no reason people would follow an outdated standard that the PCAOB adopted from the AICPA that was written back in the 1980s.
Thanks, Lynn.
Ron?
Yes, thank you, Barb. I just wanted, I guess I would, I feel like I'm piling on here a little bit, but I would agree with what John said. I do think if the PCAOB got involved in this space, and I do believe they should, that the standard would be picked up and it would be followed. I do think that I think the ESG is an extremely important space. It's as dynamic as I've ever seen in my lifetime, and the interest out there, whether it be from regulators or from investment community, is as high as anything. So I think this is probably the most important space that, or one of the most that we should all get engaged with. And I think to contradict, and I forgot the gentleman's name, I think audit qualities is probably as high as it's ever been. I'm not saying I'm not naive and think that it could be improved, but I do think it's extremely high level. Thank you to the PCAOB and what's happened over the last almost 20 years. Obviously, there's always room for improvement, and I'm not saying that there shouldn't be, but I do think that the ESG space is a space that is dynamic, that we're in need of some audit standards, and I do believe that the PCAOB should own it.
Thank you, Ron.
Sandy Peters?
Somebody asked me recently, comments on the strategic plan included anything about climate, and so I went through them all. And while some people maybe had it mentioned once without any explanation, I think Saris was the only person who went into it extensively. I guess for me, as someone who was an auditor and the like, what does owning it actually mean? Is I think really the question that the PCAOB has to answer, right? Do you have scope, or the people who are asking for it need to identify, do you legally have scope for this, is number one, and two, why the existing standards are insufficient, I think is really the question at hand to determine if in fact separate standards are needed or interpretations of existing standards in the current place. I don't think that there's a very good understanding as I talk with people about that. So I think there's work to be done about what it means to own it and be in scope really means, and what you have the capacity or what you have the legal authority to do is what I think those who are asking for it and what the PCAOB needs to do.
Thank you, Sandy.
Steve Morrison?
Hey, good morning, everyone. So I'll say two things with this is that we're talking a lot about ESG, and I realize that there's a lot of large entities out there that have information out there, and there are some legitimate concerns. At the same time, we have a significant election coming up, and the future of the SEC's proposed its assurance and disclosure requirements. I think we're having this discussion maybe a little bit early because things could change. We could spend the rest of the day talking about it, but I believe there's a lot of doubt as to whether ESG will become the next SOX or will ESG become the next conflict minerals and not have quite the same staying power that SOX has and so forth. So we're spending a lot of time talking about something that may or may not exist in its current form, or what people think its current form will be, including after this very soon election. And then also, I agree with what Dane was saying, and just to say it in very layman's terms, you have a lot on your plate for PCAOB, and my own personal preference would be I incorporate by reference, since this is a public company oriented discussion, our comment letter talking about the importance of convergence and active dialogue with other standard setters in terms of this, as opposed to going it alone, owning the space, and so forth. I think that the finite resources, even though that they have been much invigorated, and appropriately so, I think could be spent more on direct audit as opposed to the attestation, and in particular the ESG space.
Thank you, Steve.
Brian Croto?
Thanks. And we did submit a fairly lengthy comment letter in this space, so I won't get into all the details, but I agree with Sandy relative to the point about understanding kind of expectations, and I would think the SEC would have an important role to play there. So, for example, if it were the case that attestations were not subject to PCAOB inspections, and the PCAOB did create new standards that we were to apply, we would be in a position of having to apply both AICPA and PCAOB standards on a dual basis. Again, if those engagements were not subject to PCAOB inspections, just given our obligations from an AICPA perspective. And then I would just say that the AICPA certainly has made a lot of progress relative to specific, well, not only general attestation standards, but specific guidance in this space that one would want to leverage at a minimum. But I do agree with everyone that there's a lot of room in the space that the PCAOB could play an active role in, consistent with our comment letter. But again, I would think the SEC would have an important say here, as well as to their expectations as to the PCAOB's role relative to attestation engagements under any of their new rules. So I just wanted to raise the dual standards point and the inspection point as well.
Thank you, Brian.
Robert Neckel?
Hello, everyone, and good morning. I think that there's clear evidence out there, if you look at this issue on a global basis, that the United States is probably behind the 8 ball and the rest of the world is leading us. But I think there's a real fundamental question about how you could possibly own this space. There's clearly demand. The demand is moving very rapidly out there. Capital market participants and corporate entities are asking for these sort of things. I was about 4 weeks ago, I was at a meeting in Canberra with with a number of the Australian regulators talking about this issue. And one of the concerns they raised is that the IAASB standards, assuming I understood this, what they said, is that their standard is intended to be not profession centric, meaning it creates an unusual situation where they're writing a standard for people who aren't necessarily chartered accountants or CPAs. Because we already know, as somebody mentioned earlier, that many of these services are being provided by non-accountants. And that's not just in the United States, it's globally. And so if we wish to enter this from the supply side, meaning the standard side, without an illegal mandate, which may or may not be feasible in the United States, it's not clear to me how we tend to compete. Because one of the issues that was raised that particularly the chief accountant of ASEC was concerned about was that if these are being provided by non-accounting firms, those firms could in fact follow the IAASB standards, but they don't bring the rest of the infrastructure along. For example, independence training and all these other things that we're used to living with in our world. And so it makes for a very difficult situation, if nothing else, of what the competitive market looks like. There's no doubt that there's a place for us to play in this field. And my concern is that we actually should be talking about subject matter expansion, not just ESG, because there's other issues out there, and cybersecurity is a very obvious one. That if we try to start writing standards for each single type of service out there, it tends to not, and we have historical experience in the United States, if you go back as long as I've been around, that this doesn't tend to end very well. And so I would encourage us to be thinking this in a broader sense, because I really do think that accountants have a lot to offer. But the IAASB is not structured like the PCAOB. It's a very different type of organization. And so simply saying that the PCAOB is going to do this is not such a trivial question. Now, I'm not a lawyer, and maybe John White or somebody could clarify that. But owning this space is not easy. But a bigger question is, how do we create a supply side that's going to match the demand side, that actually the accounting profession gets to participate in this on a high level basis? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. I just want to do a time check. It's 2 minutes to 11. We can probably go another 7 minutes, but maybe let's try to get the rest of the questions. And I don't want to delay the OERA update too long.
Okay, so the next hands that we have up are John White, Melanie Lubin, and Dane Mott. Oh, and David Fabricant. And those are the last of the hands. So, John White, you were next.
Okay, so real quickly, I want to disagree a little bit with Steve's comment that what happens in the midterm elections affects this. Obviously, it's going to affect the direction of the SEC. But what I end up talking to boards about this all the time is that investor demand for ESG information and the related assurance is out there, and it's going to be there regardless of what the SEC does. And so companies need to be preparing for this and figuring out what they're going to be doing. And so I think the demand for assurance is there irrespective of what direction the SEC goes. The other, Lynn Turner reminded me of a little bit of history here, is, the MD&A standard, assurance standard, really has not been used at all. When it came out in the 90s, there was one attempt to use it in the IPO of Goldman Sachs, and it was used there. And I think that's kind of the one and only time it got used with any prominence. And the reason that it didn't get used anymore is because investors didn't ask for it. A lot of people, including myself, pushed underwriters to try to require it. We pushed boards to try to have their companies do it, and there was no investor demand behind it. Here I believe, have investor demand, and so I think this is just very different than some of the past, and that the demand's there, and therefore there will be, again, users.
Thanks, John. Melanie?
Thanks. So I think the first thing I have to say is my views don't necessarily reflect those of the Maryland Attorney General or the North American Securities Administrators Association. So they're my views. But John said a lot of what I wanted to say, but from a regulatory point of view, there is a lot of investor demand, and there's a lot of concern that what we're seeing in disclosure may or may not be accurate. There's a lot of concern about the greenwashing issue, and that concern goes beyond just disclosure into, what do the financials look like, what's accurate, what's not accurate. So regardless of what happens at the SEC, or what happens with the rule proposal, or what happens with all of the, ESG proposals that are not necessarily the huge ESG proposal that, was, incredibly controversial, and the, the ones that may be somewhat controversial, but less so. I think coming up with some standards that people can look to determine, how should this all be assessed will be really helpful across the board when regulators are looking at it, when investors are looking at it, when people who have to make the attestations or make assessments of what's going on know how to look at it with some kind of standards that people have reviewed and taken a look at. That kind of sets the bar so we know what we're looking at.
Thank you, Melanie.
Dane?
Sure. Thank you. Again, I want to reiterate ESG is super important. Big believer. I think it's a permanent presence in markets. Capital is being formed around ESG. So this isn't a statement about ESG. It's just we've had this last half an hour about standards updates. And once the word ESG came up, that's all the conversation became about for the rest of the conversation. So the issue is coming back to what do investors want from the PCAOB? We want, to ensure that the audits are of high quality. And to go back to the statistic, if 4% of frauds are caught by external auditors and the other 96 are caught through other means, I'd have to disagree with the statement earlier where someone's saying the audit profession's doing their best work ever. I just don't agree.
Okay, well,
We had one more, David Fabricant.
Sorry.
Thanks, Barb. I actually have a non-ESG related question. And I'm looking back at the short-term standard setting slide that you had, and as many said, it's a heavy slate. And I'm just wondering if the board is prioritizing all of these equally. Would we expect the pace of these proposals in 2023 to come out somewhat at the same time? Will they be staggered, or is there anything that we could do to maybe help advise as to what is the highest priorities for these new standards?
I'm glad you asked me that at this meeting and not at the last meeting, because it would have been much more challenging to answer at that time because we were really just getting started with the board. I think that you will see things on more of a staggered basis or a staged basis. Like we've said, we've made significant progress, but some standards are easier to work through with the board than others. But I do think we'll have a handful of things we may want input on again in the new year. But I think you'll observe some staging of things in little more even manner next year.
I appreciate that. I think QC is super important. And from a preparer's perspective, the one on technology-assisted data analysis is one that I'm acutely in tune with and would be certainly supportive of seeing that one progress.
Yeah, as are we, right? Because firms are working through implementing the other QC standards now, and I think there's probably some benefit to having them at the same time. With that, thank you all so much for the input. If we're ready, I want to go ahead. So our Office of Economic and Risk Analysis is going to give a brief overview of the many, many activities that they do. And so with that, I'm going to hand that over to Michael Gerbett and Patrick Castine.
That's great. Thank you, Barb. And Brian, if you could bring up the slides for me, please. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Michael Gerbett, Acting Director of the PCAOB's Office of Economic and Risk Analysis, or OERA for short. It's my pleasure to be here today alongside my colleague Patrick Castine, again, to share with you some insight into OERA's work in advancing the PCAOB's mission. And of course, the standard disclaimer does apply. The views that Patrick and I will express today are, of course, our own and may not reflect the views of the board as a whole, any individual board members or other staff. Okay, well, I'd like to start today, if I may, with some historical context. And as I think some of you will probably know, our office was formed in 2017 through a merger of two groups within PCAOB, the Center for Economic Analysis and the Office of Research and Analysis. And so really as a result of that merger, and as we'll get into shortly, our group now supports oversight activities across the full breadth of the PCAOB. But I think that at the end of the day, what really ties our group together is the team's shared goal of advancing the PCAOB mission through high quality data-driven research. Now, as you can see there on the slide, our work in OERA covers 6 key areas. First, economic analysis. We work with our colleagues in OCA on standard setting and with our colleagues in OGC on other forms of rulemaking to develop economic analyses that assist the board in developing rules and standards for auditors that serve the public interest and protect investors. Second, post-implementation review. We select based on certain criteria, newly adopted or newly revised rules or standards for retrospective reviews. Is the rule or standard achieving its intended objective, and how is it impacting key stakeholders? Third, risk analysis. We analyze economic risks, industry-level risks, accounting risks, and also company-level risks to identify specific audits and aspects of those audits for DRI's consideration when planning inspections and selecting individual audits for review. Fourth, economic modeling. We have on our team PhD-level economists who develop econometric models that systematically analyze risk in the issuer population. These models essentially provide another lens through which we support DRI's inspection selection processes and help ensure we best utilize available resources in inspections. Fifth, business intelligence. We transform data, both internal data as well as third-party data, into actionable intelligence that supports work and oversight activities across the whole breadth of the PCAOB. And finally, research and relationships with academia. We aim to foster both the PCAOB's connection with academia, that's very important to us, as well as the production of high-quality academic research that informs not only our understanding of the audit, but also the impact of our oversight on the audit process and capital markets. Okay, so moving on now, we'll dig into each of these 6 areas in a bit more detail. And in keeping with this group's primary interest, I'll begin with our work in economic analysis. Okay, so what is the role of economic analysis? Well, I believe economic analysis helps ensure that PCAOB rulemaking is informed by the best information available, is appropriately motivated, and thoughtfully assesses the benefits and costs of new or revised requirements. Now, as this group will already be aware, the typical standard setting process at PCAOB begins with development of a proposing release, and our economists will prepare a preliminary economic analysis at that stage. That economic analysis is included in the proposing release, which of course is then put out for public comment. I will take this opportunity to make a pitch here. We always request data as part of the comment process, and to be entirely frank, we don't get a lot of it. So please, if you have relevant data, certainly we'd love to receive it. So next, after receiving comments on the proposal and of course, hopefully data, our economists then prepare a final economic analysis for inclusion in the board's adopting release. That analysis will address, of course, economic comments received at the proposal stage, and once adopted by the board, the adopting release, including the final economic analysis, is then submitted to the SEC for approval. As I said earlier, in OERA, we always look to utilize data in our work. And that means we also look to quantify our economic analyses to the extent possible. In developing economic analyses, we look to various data sources available to us. Those data sources include information from our inspections program, information from PCAOB filings, information from SEC filings, and of course, information from third-party data providers as well. Frequently, however, we do experience data limitations. And so oftentimes our economic analyses tend to be more qualitative in nature, although still informed, of course, by available evidence and academic literature. Now, our North Star for performing economic analyses is our 2014 staff guidance on economic analysis in PCAOB standard setting, which you can find available on the PCAOB website. Development of our guidance was informed by the SEC's 2012 current guidance on economic analysis in SEC rulemakings, and both of those documents in turn follow best practice for performing economic analysis of governmental agency administrative rulemaking, including, of course, OMB Circular A4, as well as relevant executive orders. Now, as may be familiar to many of you, every economic analysis we produce has 4 key components, and I'll spend a few minutes here just to briefly discuss each of those. So first, we establish the baseline for evaluating impacts. What is the current state of the world, and more specifically, how are auditors behaving today, and what information are investors receiving? Second, we identify the need for rulemaking, specifically, what's the market failure that's causing behavior to fall short of where we want it to be? It could be, for example, information asymmetry, where one party, and in our space that would typically be the auditor, knows more information than another. Again, in our space, typically that would be investors or the audit committee. And so then that second party may, of course, act in suboptimal ways simply because they're in the dark. And moreover, because of the informational difference, auditors may lack sufficient incentives to either perform cost-intensive audit procedures or to sufficiently invest in audit quality. So we establish the baseline, we identify the need. Third, we assess how the proposed or the final standard meets that need, and as a result, what benefits will be produced. We also evaluate the costs associated with achieving those benefits, and in addition, whether the new requirements could give rise to unintended consequences. Fourth and finally, we evaluate reasonable alternatives. Was there a different approach that we could have taken, and what would have been the costs and the benefits of that path not followed? We also prepare, as part of our economic analysis, an assessment of the application of the proposed or final standard to audits of emerging growth companies, or EGCs for short. In the Jobs Act of 2012, Congress said that the SEC cannot apply our rules to audits of EGCs unless the SEC determines that the application is necessary or appropriate in the public interest after considering the protection of investors and whether the action will promote efficiency, competition, and capital formation. Now, so that the SEC can do all of that, we perform an analysis of any particular effects that a standard might have on audits of EGCs. So if our proposed standard could have a differential impact on EGCs, perhaps because of some feature of their size, their industry, or their auditors, our economists would explore that possibility in the analysis, which then, of course, in turn, helps the SEC in making its determination and meeting its obligation, again, under the Jobs Act of 2012. Now, our ability to understand if those particular effects exist and what they might be is significantly assisted by an annual staff white paper authored by OIRA's business intelligence team. That white paper provides yearly information about the number and the nature of EGCs, as well as firms that audit their financial statements. And again, those white papers are available for review through the PCAOB website. Now, of course, our list of recent economic analyses is not surprisingly coextensive with the list of standards and rules recently adopted by the board. Over time, I think it would be fair to say that our economic analyses have evolved to increasingly utilize inspections data, as well as data from filings made by registered firms. And recent economic analyses, including our rulemakings on estimates and specialists and supervision of other auditors, have used analysis of this type of data to assist us in evaluating likely effects. Now, with respect to our current activities, and as you've heard Barb and the chair say, the board is obviously pursuing the most ambitious standard setting agenda in the history of the PCAOB, which certainly means our economists are busy. In particular, with all these projects in the works, you might be somewhat surprised to hear that this group is as small as it is. I think while we may be small, I would say we are certainly mighty. The team comprises 8 individuals, 6 PhD economists plus 2 senior research analysts, And they also work closely with other OERA staff and can, and in fact do, borrow resources from across the office, especially from our post-implementation review team, which again supports our ability to deliver high quality economic analysis. Okay, so I just mentioned post-implementation review, and I'm going to turn, in fact, now to that topic. And of course, we'll make sure to save some time for questions and comments before wrapping up. So, as I indicated earlier on, we conduct post-implementation reviews, and I'll use the term PIR here for short, but we conduct PIRs of new or newly revised standards or rules to see if those new requirements are doing what they're supposed to be doing or could be doing it better. Just like I talked about benefits, costs, and unintended consequences in developing economic analysis as part of the rulemaking process, we think about those things again as part of our PIRs. Are we seeing benefits from the rule, including the benefits we expected to see, or benefits that perhaps were more surprising? How costly was the rule to implement? What was the cost for big firms? What was the cost for small firms? What portion of those costs were fixed? What portion were ongoing? Did we see cost implications for different sizes or different types of issuers? And finally, are we seeing evidence that points to unintended consequences? Frequently, commenters will predict unintended consequences as part of the rulemaking process, and while the board evaluates those assertions before adopting a rule, we do like to test those through our PIRs to see if they came to pass, or perhaps more frequently, based at least on analysis to date, did not. So overall, just to briefly summarize here, PIRs essentially complement the economic analysis developed at the rulemaking stage by providing the board with that second opportunity to look at the overall effect of a rule or standard, notably with the added benefit of access to new data from the implementation period itself. For example, because of a good PIR, we may find evidence that suggests additional guidance may be needed. Perhaps it's direct, for example, survey respondents telling us they're confused, or indirect, for example, benefits not manifesting in the way we expected. Alternatively, perhaps those benefits are not manifesting due to incomplete implementation of the standard, in which case DRI might be able to leverage our findings to, shall we say, follow up. Another possibility, though, is that the standard just isn't doing what we thought it was going to do. Perhaps unintended consequences are predominating, and we might want to rethink certain aspects of the standard itself. I will say here that historically this is not an outcome we've seen, but of course, theoretically it certainly could be. PIRs can also help increase awareness of our standards. For example, oftentimes we conduct, as part of our PIRs, quite extensive stakeholder outreach. And while that outreach provides us with access to data for analysis, it can also help us reach stakeholders who were, up until now, unaware of a change and now would be. We might even identify a lack of awareness that could prompt us to work with our Office of Communications and Engagement on steps forward. Finally, PIRs can also look at questions raised during the comment process and allow us to perform research or to clarify or answer those questions. Now, while any new or revised standard or rule could in theory be the subject of a PIR, of course, like everything else in life, we don't have the luxury of infinite resources. For some rules, a PIR could bring significant benefits, and for other rules, it might just add less value. So that we can use our resources judiciously, we consider various factors in determining whether to perform a PIR, and if so, how to scope it. Of course, first and foremost, has the board or the SEC asked us to do one already? And obviously, that's less a factor for consideration and more of a hard and fast criterion. Let's suppose, though, that there isn't that level of firm direction. Then at that point, relevant factors would include, first of all, the expected magnitude of the impacts. Additionally, the team would also consider whether, at the time of adoption, those impacts were, shall I say, more or less certain. And of course, on that point, all of our rulemakings obviously involve, at some level, an educated guess at what the future will hold. And sometimes the crystal ball is clearer, and sometimes, of course, more cloudy. So we look at the magnitude and the degree of uncertainty around impacts. Next, the team will evaluate their potential research design and the availability of relevant data. For example, what will be our analytical approach to identify impacts? How are we going to measure those impacts? And what data will be available for us to use? Can we provide evidence of more causal effects, or are we limited to more descriptive statistics? And will we need to gather data from stakeholder groups? And if so, how readily can we do that? Finally, the staff also consider potential uses of the analysis. And these, of course, parallel the uses of post-implementation reviews in general that I discussed before. Again, is the analysis expected to help the board evaluate the need for more guidance, improve awareness of new requirements, or help with the development of similar standards? Okay, so how do we go about evaluating impacts? What are the different tools in our toolkit? Well, first of all, we might interview people who are affected by the implementation. Sometimes that's through a structured conversation. Other times we might use a data collection tool, such as a web-based survey, to gather data from a larger pool of respondents. We also look at whether hard data is available, either to provide descriptive statistics on changes in the audit process over time, or where possible, more causal econometric analysis to attribute those changes to the specific rulemaking. Finally, another option open to us is to issue a formal public request for comment. Sometimes this option can be effective, although I will say usually we have to work more actively to capture adequate data. And of course, if we go this route, and again, not to be a broken record, we would love to get data in response to those requests. Now, once we've done our analysis, at that point, we would typically prepare a board report summarizing key findings and next steps. Additionally, we would also typically issue one or more supporting staff white papers. Those white papers would set forth the analysis and the findings in greater detail, and importantly, and consistent here with best practice, provide transparency into our research methods as well as other technical details of our analysis. Now, as a general rule, PIRs take place some years after a rule or standard has been in effect. Standards may take, at a minimum, at least a couple of years to fully bed in. And so, of course, because of that, attempting to evaluate impacts too early could result in us missing important effects. Now, on the other hand, an interim analysis can be performed at a much earlier stage. And in fact, this is what we would typically do. Of course, an interim analysis generates only preliminary findings, but nevertheless, it can also serve as a useful early warning of benefits not being achieved, costs being greater than expected, or possibly the presence of unexpected effects. Moreover, because it can take some amount of lead time to develop any necessary regulatory response, this kind of early temperature check on the effectiveness of implementation could certainly be important. Turning now quickly to this group's recent work, on our website, you can see a description of our PIR program and a completed PIR on AS 1220 engagement quality review. Additionally, we currently have 2 reviews in process, one on recent changes to the auditor's reporting model and specifically the communication of critical audit matters, and one on recent revisions to requirements for auditing accounting estimates and the auditor's use of the work of specialists. I'll note here that our review of the changes to the auditor's reporting model has already produced results. For this rulemaking, the SEC directed us to perform analysis on the impact of critical audit matters after the implementation date for audits of large accelerated filers, but before the implementation date for audits of all other issuers to which the CAM requirements apply. And so, of course, we did. A board report summarizing our results plus 2 staff white papers, the first summarizing our extensive stakeholder outreach and the second our large sample statistical analysis were all completed and again can be accessed through the PCAOB website. In addition, later this year, I expect us to publish further materials summarizing more recent work in PIR. Those will include a second round of results on critical audit matters, covering implementation for everyone, plus a first look at the impact of the new requirements for auditing accounting estimates and auditors' use of the work of specialists. And again, those results will all be posted and made available via the PCAOB website. In terms of staffing, 6 full-time PhD economists comprise our PIR team. And similar to our work on prospective economic analysis, they also benefit from being able to lean on other areas of specific expertise that's available across the broader OERA team. Okay, well, with that, I'll turn the floor now to Patrick Castine, who's been waiting here patiently and is going to discuss the work of our terrific risk analysis, economic modeling, and business intelligence groups. Patrick.
Thank you, Mike, and good morning, everyone. I want to give you an introduction into our OERA risk analysis, economic modeling, and business intelligence groups. I'll start off by saying, unfortunately, I can't go into the details of the important work these groups are responsible for, given the extent to which their work product informs our inspection, selection, and enforcement activities. But I certainly will do my best to give an overview, starting with risk analysis. So we got that. Thank you. Our risk analysis team provides critical support to DRI's inspection planning and selection processes. Among other things, the team analyzes economic trends, corporate transactions, along with industry-level risks, significant accounting issues, and issuer filings, all to identify higher-risk issuer audits, which we then refer to DRI for consideration for inspection planning and selection. Additionally, we also identify suggested audit focus areas within those audits where DRI might find it fruitful to spend their time. Moreover, we further track and highlight areas of emerging audit risk to communicate within the PCAOB, including our colleagues in DRI and DEI. And finally, we provide data and analysis to DEI to assist our enforcement team in case identification. Now, staffing in this area, we primarily have CPAs with significant and specific experience identifying areas of audit risk. We also bring in staff from other areas of OERA as needed to help complement their work. Our next group is the economic modeling group. While our risk analysis team is focused more on the practical side of risk analysis as reflected in the staffing of CPAs, our economic modeling team provides an important complement to that approach by looking at risks through the development of predictive econometric models that systematically assess risk based on issuer financial data, issuer characteristics, and other sources of information. Once again, the output of the models is used to inform DRI's inspection selection processes, and unfortunately, I can't go into much more detail about what data they're utilizing. Our economic modeling staff group is currently composed of 4 full-time employees, 3 PhD economists, and 1 data modeling manager. It's a large amount of data to work with, so we do have to bring in some data expertise there. But more importantly, this group also will be assisted by staff in other areas of OERA. The CPAs, academic fellows, our research and data analysts, because this is a comprehensive data set, and we need insights from more than just the PhD economist at this point. And last but not least, I'd like to highlight our business intelligence team. It's made of analysts that pull together data from multiple diverse sources to generate data sets, insights, and analysis that are used to support work across the PCAOB. Sadly, we don't have beautiful, clean data just sitting there waiting for someone to push a button and yield insights. Rather, it takes a great deal of work and skill to make those sources talk to each other, and a lot of deep understanding to manipulate the data into valuable business intelligence for other offices and divisions and our colleagues within ERA. A good portion of BI's work supports DRI and the inspection process, but we also inform a broad spectrum of PCAOB staff and the public, including through the annual Emerging Growth Company white paper that Mike mentioned a few minutes ago. The business intelligence team is composed of 8 full-time employees. They're subject matter experts, not only in their data aggregation skills, but also in the knowledge of the data we're working with. It helps generate quality work that informs, again, a broad audience within the PCAOB. The team includes CPAs, data analysts, and financial statement analysts. So, Mike, I think I've got.
Thanks, Patrick. Appreciate that. So finally for today, and then Patrick and I can take questions or hear comments. I'd just like to touch briefly on the work of our office in fostering research and the PCAOB's relationship with academia. And one key way through which we foster our connection with academics and the broader academic community is through the PCAOB's academic fellowship program. And in fact, I'm proud to say that one of our current SEIAG members, of course, Professor Preeti Chowdhury, is in fact a former PCAOB research fellow. Now, earlier this month, we announced our call for fellows for the 2023-2024 academic year. These fellowships allow us to work with academics, generally for a one-year term, to help generate research and additionally allow our staff level activities to be informed by outside academic perspectives. Our fellows then use that experience plus appropriate access to internal PCAOB data as a springboard to produce high quality research papers, many of which have been published in top tier journals. And in fact, since this program began 8 years ago now, 15 academics have joined the PCAOB as fellows and have produced over that time more than 20 working papers and published studies. And again, you can see all of those papers on our website under resources for academics. We also held just 2 weeks ago our 9th annual conference on auditing and capital markets. That conference was, at least in my humble opinion, a great success and covered, as you can see there on the slide, a broad array of timely topics covering issues ranging from how auditors find their clients to how they do their work to how they report out to investors. And so this conference, again, is another key way through which we connect and exchange ideas with academics, and in fact, almost 400 academics registered for this year's event. Okay, well, with that, thank you all for your time. I hope that was helpful. I'll stop there, and Patrick and I will be happy to take any questions or hear any comments.
Keisha?
Good morning, and thank you for that informative update. I just had a thought as you were talking about the academic outreach, and what you've done in the past is outstanding. I've benefited from some of those activities myself, but just a consideration, sometimes in academia, a one-year commitment might be problematic. So one consideration, especially with the level of activity that is happening both in your office and in standard setting, give some thought to maybe introducing a summer opportunity that would be more, streamlined, maybe for a specific topic or task, but that way you're broadening casting the net wider to maybe reach more people, but also in a target time frame where more academics may be well suited to participate, especially with all the things that are going on. So that's just a consideration for you all to think about as you continue to expand your academic outreach. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Keisha.
Jennifer Joe.
Yeah, actually, Keisha and I were on the same mindset because I had a similar thought. Also, even if not for a summer commitment, whether your office has considered bringing in people for special projects because they're academics who might have expertise in a specific area that you're working in. And so collaborating with them, using the same, I know that a lot of the data is confidential, but the same protocols that you use for people who are engaged in a fellowship that could be adopted for somebody to come in and work on a specific topic. The second thing I wanted to comment on was the critical audit matters post-implementation review. I mean, I found it very helpful looking at the reports that were done so far, and I'm eagerly looking forward to the release in 2024 of the more comprehensive report. What I didn't see in the report was some analysis tying investors' concerns and call for more information about risk in the CAM disclosures and whether, that was actually occurring in auditors' disclosures. My sort of anecdotal review just seems to suggest that the concern about boilerplate CAMs might actually be being realized. And so wondering what your office is doing to provide some information in this space.
Thanks for that, Jennifer. And you won't need to wait until 2024. We do plan to issue some reports later on this year, in fact, to provide some updated information on what we're seeing regarding the impact of CAMs. And so hopefully those will be informative for you in addressing some of the comments that you just made.
Thank you.
Lynn?
The SEC has some staff guidance out on how they perform economic analysis, including cost benefit. They have made that, they have now posted that to their website, as I recall. Have you followed their lead and posted your staff guidance to the website? That's the first question. The second question is, I heard you say and discuss on a number of times language about looking for unintended consequences. In Washington, D.C., that's short speak for let's not go do a rulemaking. In your staff guidance, is there language that discusses the fact that you need to balance out this notion of unintended consequences with the benefits to investors, and that at times those consequences may very well be worth the benefit that investors get? And then the last thing is, Patrick talked about some marvelous data that you get. I know from remarks that have been made by past board chairs that the group has done significant research, including while Jonas was there, on AQIs. It seems like the data that you are gathering to form a basis for inspection, some of that may be very valuable AQI type information. What's your plans for rolling that research out in a more transparent manner that would benefit investors?
Great, thank you for those questions, Lynn. So I'll take them in order. You asked first of all about the SEC 2012 staff guidance. So our staff guidance is indeed modeled in large part on the SEC staff guidance, and is actually available on our website. That was published in 2014, and you can find that there and look at that at your leisure. That guidance does indeed address how we evaluate costs and benefits and unintended consequences. Those are all obviously important things that we think carefully about during the rulemaking process, and we'll again revisit as part of our post-implementation reviews. Coming to the topic of AQIs, and obviously we do have a session on firm and engagement performance measures later today. And I don't want to get too far ahead of that. I'll just say that, as you mentioned, OERA has, of course, assisted prior boards in evaluating AQIs and will also be an integral part of the current work on firm and engagement performance measures that we'll discuss later as well. As with all rulemaking projects, we'll need to carefully evaluate any potential measures that might be required, again, in terms of benefits, costs, and unintended consequences. And I expect we'll get into some of those issues this afternoon.
Hey, Michael, thank you. Could you just send us a link on your website to where we could find that staff guidance, please?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I can pop that in the chat after this session.
Thanks.
Jeff Mahoney?
Can you hear me this time?
We can, thank you.
Oh, that's great. I had some brilliant comments in the last session when my audio wasn't working, but let me comment on this session. I'm interested in the interim analysis that you're going to do on critical audit matters, and I would just respectfully request that you consider two issues or two additional issues in connection with that analysis. One is to see whether you could include some quantification and related analysis of the discrepancy that seems to exist between the information and audit reports on the same audit for dual listed companies. You may have seen an October 6th story by Helen Thomas in the Financial Times, where she gave several examples of US audit reports of dual listed companies that contain substantially less information about areas of accounting judgment compared to the key audit matters in the report of the other country in which the company was listed. So I think it would be very interesting to provide some quantification of how often that's happening, and then any analysis as to why it's occurring and what it means with respect to the quality of the implementation of the CAM standard. The second area that I would like to see you take a look at is if you could identify and potentially analyze the number of issuers whose critical audit matters included the disclosures described in items 3 and 4 of the note to paragraph 14C of the PCAOB standard. You might recall item 3 in that note indicates that you may include in your CAMs a disclosure of an indication of the outcome of the audit procedures. And item 4 in that note indicates that you may include in your CAMs a disclosure of key observations with respect to the critical audit matter. So I think it would be very useful if you could quantify how frequently we see in US CAMs any disclosures related to those items, item 3 and 4 in the note. I think to the extent that you're not seeing any disclosures on those two items, I think it's significant because CII and many investors asked for those types of disclosures in connection with the development of the standard. So thanks again for considering these two suggestions.
Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate those.
So in the interest of time, we have 3 hands up, so we're going to call on those. So it's Preeti, Robert, and Sarah. So Preeti?
Hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I wanted to support the idea that Jeff just raised about comparing the KCAMs and CCAMs, but more specifically wondered if in that project you could focus specifically also on climate risk to see what disclosures are being made and whether there are discrepancies between KCAMs and CCAMs. And then secondly, whether there's discussion of climate risk and the risk factors, but doesn't appear in the CAMs. I'm just confused as to, do we need more guidance for the firms on how to discuss climate risk? Just looking at that specific issue more carefully. And then my second comment is, I'm hoping that by putting on your research agenda, firm engagement metrics, what we're going to see from the PCAOB is a follow-up from the 2015 white paper and some analysis on some of these characteristics and which ones are showing associations with audit quality, et cetera. Or is there something else that you have in mind in this part of the research agenda? I'm not really sure. So I'd like a little insight on that, and I'd encourage you to do some analysis in that space.
That's great. Thank you, Preeti, for those suggestions. And again, we'll get to firm and engagement performance measures this afternoon and talk a bit more about that then.
Robert?
I was going to make a very short comment, but now I want to follow up on something Preeti said. First of all, we have to keep in mind, I'm aware of this distinction between international CAMs and US CAMs, K and C, but they're also different in standards. So it's not necessarily surprising that you're going to get some differences across the different disclosure regimes. And that maybe is a question we should be talking about, is how do we make those things more comparable? And then I know Michael fairly well, and I know this issue of working with unintended consequences. I mean, the answer to are there unintended consequences is simple. The answer is yes. The question that I think Lynn raised it is, how serious are they and how serious can they be? Now, the one thing I actually was going to say initially was there is a dissertation coming out of France, of all places, but they're looking at US data on CAMs. And one of the things they find using some machine learning techniques is, in fact, US CAMs are actually quite informative if you know how to look at, if you know how to read them. Now, that may mean that the average person with the average reading comprehension cannot do that, but certainly machine learning shows in this study that, in fact, there is differences and particular unusual differences in the tails that definitely signal information content. So this is something I think that his group might want to follow up on it a little bit. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. Appreciate that.
Sarah?
Thank you. And actually, Robert and I were on the same wavelength a little bit there. I think it's important that we do remember the standards were intentionally different when CCAMs and KCAMs were set. And at the risk of blurring the two conversations we've already had, I think it's incredibly important that as we embark on this very aggressive standard setting agenda, we're very clear where the standards are intended to be different. So we have widely known, widely used standards of the IAASB, the ASB, and when the PCAOB is creating different standards that have a performance difference where auditors are doing different work, or a reporting difference where what we're going to report is intentionally different, the more we can do in the exposure draft stage to highlight that for investors, to get that weigh in early to say, is this what you want? Do you want this outcome? Is really important. And the more we can actually speak about that, I think helps us inform the standards that we're setting and that we're doing what is expected and intended. So that it doesn't get to the PIR stage where people are starting to take notice and get excited and really wonder why this is happening. And so if there's anything, maybe even potentially this group can collaborate with through the proposal process to say, okay, based on how we do PIR, based on how we get this information later, is there a way we can funnel that in earlier? Is there a way we can reach investors sooner to make sure that we're meeting the needs of the capital markets? I think that would be really an excellent collaboration if that's possible.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
So I see Dane has put up his hand. So Dane, you're going to go last.
Super quick, just want to echo Jeff's comments, but I mean, the issue for users, with different CAMs and different things you're going to get from reading a different document. If we think about the user has the expectation that they're going to have a holistic view when they read those sections from one to another. So I would just say it is important to harmonize and to make sure if there's differentiation between those things, the different KCAMs, CCAMs, that there's a section to kind of point out those differences. So if we're going to one document or the other document, we're going to get that holistic picture.
All right. Mike, do you have anything else?
No, I appreciate all of the inputs and the feedback from everyone, but I think over to you, Jessica.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so we'll be breaking for lunch, and the next session starts at 12:45.